So, welcome to today's hot topic conversation, hosted by PLMA's Electric Transportation Interest Group. Um, Today's topic: EVs behaving badly. Apex Analytics Electric Vehicle Study for the Regional Technical Forum was brought to you by the Electric Transportation Interest Group. You can see the four co-chairs here. Dubbed them earlier today the Sisters of Electric Transportation. Katie Parkinson from now Pipes and Wires Consulting is the one who brought us this conversation, and she will introduce our speaker today.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I want to introduce Noah Lieb from Apex Analytics. I'm so proud to have him join us. I've been working with him for over 15 years, I think we're going at now. He's coming to us from Ojai, California, and has done some really great work with electric vehicles, in particular regarding how they interact with the grid in terms of energy efficiency, meaning the way that we plan for electric vehicles joining the grid is really going to matter when it comes to how efficiently they are using their electricity. So this is going to come into play more and more as EV adoption grows. So we're very excited to have Noah join in. Thank you very much. And noteworthy, we want to encourage you guys to ask questions, but put them in the chat. Rich will kind of bring that up shortly, but please put those in the chat and we will be addressing those at the end. But as your questions come up throughout the presentation, please bring those in and enter those into the chat. Go for it, Noah.
Okay, great. Thanks, Katie. Thanks for the introduction. Got a lot of slides today, so I'm just going to touch on most of them pretty briefly. And then at the end, Q&A, we can come back to any that you might have questions on, worried about getting stuck on any particular slide, given there's a lot of them. So we're going to cover the work that we did for the Regional Technical Forum, what the objective of the study was, just review some EV background definitions before we dive into the actual study, taking a look at EV efficiency, and then we'll end up with EV load at the end. Next slide. All right. So the objectives of this study, we wanted to characterize electric vehicle market, to identify EV efficiency. Really, the goal here was to say, well, there's a lot of electric vehicles on the road. People are buying them. There might be higher efficiency and lower efficiency vehicles. How would a utility go about identifying what makes an electric vehicle efficient? And how do we possibly create a new measure and quantify the savings for that energy and or demand savings for that EV based on the market. Also, we took a look at level 2 chargers, DR potential, and some load shape data as well, which is in development right now. Next slide. So just a caveat here before we dive in, as everyone knows, there's a lot of new technology on the road and in our panels, in our garage, and so forth. And so whatever we say now is likely to be outdated pretty rapidly, given the pace of change that we see in the market and technology. Also, there's a lot of data that we had available, both publicly available and also internally. And really rarely do we see so much data available for a new measure like this. Yet not everything was perfect. There were a lot of disconnects and issues with matching EV model trims across the various data sources. So we'll go into that in more detail in the next slides. So next slide, please. So some of the data that we used EPA data, state registration data. We used data from Rolling Energy Resources, a managed charging company that had active charging sessions for over 6,000 EVs at the time. We used VIN decoding tool that we developed to be able to match VIN across the various data sources where it was available. We also conducted secondary research and finally used the DOE Fuels Data Center for maximum power acceptance data as well. Next slide. All right, so just some quick backgrounds and definitions. Next slide. All right, so in order to create an efficient EV measure, we first had to create a classification or hierarchy of how we group these would-be measure into higher efficiency bins and lower efficiency bins and what different classes we could create. And so the focus of this was really on passenger vehicles and light-duty trucks. We didn't really explore heavy-duty, medium-duty vehicles as part of this study, and this is as defined by the DOE. Next slide. So in thinking about EVs as a measure, there is a model, as we typically know, using Tesla here as an example, Model 3 or Model X, although that really doesn't provide sufficient granularity for our purposes. We also had to look at, well, what is the trim and what is the drive type? So is it all-wheel drive or two-wheel drive? What is the trim specifically associated with it? So is it a performance? Is it a long range? Is it the plaid? Is it standard? And then finally, also we found really important too were the wheel size as well. So manufacturers produce various wheel sizes within each of these editions, and that's important in consideration for the EV efficiency as well. Next slide. All right, so taking a look at EV efficiency, the EPA already publishes this data, and it's available on the Monroney label, which is available with all new vehicles. You see that the stickers on the windows, and this is what we've seen for a long time now. And they've created a comparable sticker for electric vehicles as well. And so the EPA currently validates, classifies, and tests the vehicles and creates an efficiency metric. Next slide covers the metric in more detail. So we can see here miles per gallon equivalent for EV. We do some conversions from the 34 metric that we see there, kilowatt hours per gallon, and we do a conversion to miles per kilowatt hour. So the metric that we used really for this study was the miles per kilowatt hour. So similar to miles per gallon, the higher the value, the more efficient the vehicle is. And vehicles tend to be on a high scale of like 4 miles per kilowatt hour to a low where I think it's even less than 1, like 0.8 miles per kilowatt hour, or maybe it's 1.8 miles per kilowatt hour. But either way, higher efficiency, higher miles per kilowatt hour. Next slide. Okay, so EV efficiency in particular, next slide. We thought of this, or we approached this from two primary options. The first option was EPA already publishes an efficiency rating for vehicles. Let's just use this. And what we did was, well, as long as we have real world driving and charging data, let's take a look at real world data and compare that and validate that against the EPA rating values. And we also had all the EVs and registration data as well within the Pacific Northwest region. Secondly, what we can do is we can create a model, an explanatory model, statistical regression, where we have all the various physical attributes of the vehicles themselves and try to explain efficiency through the attributes. And we took two different approaches for this. We use the attributes and try to explain real world driving efficiency as a function of these attributes. And then also we use the EPA classification. So the EPA rating for EV efficiency, and then the same attributes to try to explain that efficiency. Okay, next slide. All right, so the first approach using the EPA efficiency ratings has some advantages. Next slide. Those advantages are that they publish this data, and there are a lot of vehicles that are represented within this data. For some reason, the data didn't come through here. There's a median or average value that is associated with the efficiency for each of these vehicle classes. So we have this broken out between two-wheel drive and all-wheel drive. And this shows that there's a wide range of EV efficiency. This is the upper quartile and lower quartile of EV efficiency for each of these vehicle classes. And so we would be able to establish low efficiency, high efficiency ratings based on the EPA efficiency values, and therefore be able to say, okay, this vehicle's lower efficiency and this vehicle's higher efficiency, create a baseline, and then be able to determine unit energy savings from these based on most, not all of the classes. You can see some of the classes don't really have wide variance in efficiency, nor do they have many counts of vehicles currently being produced for those classes, but a lot of classes do. Next slide. So the EPA uses a comprehensive test procedure, and they have two different ways of approaching this. The first is a 2-cycle test, where they run it on city and highway tests. The other is a 5-cycle test. They use 3 additional test cycles, and those include temperature extremes. So they run it in hot, they run it in cold, and then they run it with sort of more of aggressive, high speed, more frequent braking and so forth to test more typical driving behavior, aggressive driving behavior. Next slide. So this is an example of estimated per EV unit annual energy savings. If we were to take the average efficiency rating from the EPA and then the highest decile rated efficiency for each of these vehicle classes, assuming 13,000 miles driven per year, we see savings anywhere between 200 to 1,000 kilowatt hours annually for the highest efficiency EVs on the road. Next slide. So that's all well and good. EPA rates them, lots of vehicles in there, classification, great, range of efficiency, great. But what wasn't great was once we started using real world driving data to compare that against. So next slide. So we had real world 6,000 vehicles. The RER data captures telematics. We use that to then estimate the miles driven per kilowatt hour to get miles per kilowatt hour, and use that to compare against the EPA ratings. Next slide. So this is a comparison by major manufacturer. You'll see not every manufacturer is in here. Some of them, the telematics data wasn't really available for them through the group of 6,000 vehicles. Others just had too low a count where we just didn't have the data that really provided statistically significant estimates on on EV efficiency. You can see here though, grouping these based on the 2-cycle test versus a 5-cycle test really distinguishes the two groups. That those that follow the 2-cycle test tend to have real-world driving efficiency that's close to, if not right on the spot with the EPA rating efficiency, whereas those that use the alternative 5-cycle test rated much lower than the EPA rating. So real-world driving at 80% for Audis, 75% for Rivians, and Teslas, the lowest at 72% against comparing real world driving against the EPA ratings. Next slide. Looking at this a little deeper, we look at the actual versus the rated efficiencies between each of these manufacturers, grouping them again based on the 2-cycle versus the 5-cycle test. And we can see that highest efficiency here are the Chevrolets at 3.6 against the EPA rated 3.4, all the way to the worst over there on the right, the Teslas. Real world, we're at 2.6 against the EPA ratings of 3.6. So some vast differences there in efficiency between these vehicles. Next slide. And this wasn't an anomaly, nor was it a single model that was driving the differences. Exploring these specifically to each of the individual models themselves within the Tesla ecosystem, we see that really across the board, all of the models, real world driving against EPA ratings varied significantly. The best performing were at 77% there for the Model 3s. And then the worst performing were the Model S's at 64%, real world against EPA ratings. Next slide, please. Okay, so what explains the difference in EPA versus real world? So the first is that there is the potential for an overstatement of range, and related to that is the use of the 5-cycle test. At the time, we really couldn't quantify the magnitude of this difference, but seeing those charts, seeing the manufacturers that choose the 2-cycle versus the 5-cycle test, clearly there's something there that should explain that disconnect between the real world driving data that we saw against the EPA ratings. Furthermore, there's just model matching. As I explained earlier, we had to try to match all the vehicles in the real world driving data using the VIN data. The VIN data itself only has a limited group of attributes and vehicle specifications that we could try to match. We don't know the wheel size there's no wheel size in the VIN data. There's just imperfect matching, being able to take that data from the driving data, the real world data that we had back against the EPA data. So there's this imperfect matching, which certainly explains some of the variance. We estimate it's probably between about 15, could be even upwards of 20% of the variance just on the model matching itself. And then finally, there's driver behavior. We know that just look out on the road, people drive crazy or they drive very conservatively and everywhere in between. And this behavior is really, really, really an important factor, and one that we just can't explain with the data itself. But anyone that drives on the highway, on the road, you know this, you see this every day. So next slide. Also, other factors here, the way people use their vehicles. People use the dog mode, which cools their vehicles. Anyone that you see it in parking lots, you see it at trailheads, people just run their AC in the summer, they run their heating system in the winter, they keep their dogs nice and warm, or even if there's no dog in there, they run their HVAC all the time, even when they're not in there, and that has a drain on the battery. Also, other factors, there's this winter preheating system that Tesla offers, and a lot of the other EVs offer all these other attributes that just drain the battery in general. And we can't really take that use of that specific attribute of that vehicle and to be able to then quantify it and plug it into our model, which we're going to talk about here next. So these are some other considerations too. So next slide. So the second approach we took was to try to explain efficiency through attributes using statistical regressions, where we use the attributes themselves to try to either explain the EPA rated efficiency, ignoring real world driving, or using the real world driving data and the efficiency there, and use those attributes to explain efficiency. And unfortunately, neither were strong models, very weak explanatory power, no matter which way we ran it. So next slide. So the question here is, can we model EV efficiency? So again, using real world data and plugging in loads of different attributes. This is just one example model that we used using vehicle class, the temperature, battery capacity, vehicle weight, drive type, so that's all-wheel drive versus two-wheel drive, and vehicle age to explain efficiency. The second test, similarly, using the EPA rating efficiency, using similar attributes to try to explain variance in efficiency as well. Next slide. So why this is the positive sort of similar thumbs up here to this approach? Well, we had a lot of data, and we had the data available through RAR. We had some of the data available through the EPA. We had some of the data available through the VIN data. And some of these impacts we estimated as being positively correlated with efficiency or negatively correlated with efficiency. And I can't go through each of these ones, but a whole lot of attributes, a whole lot of data used to explain these models. Next slide. So in the positive sense, positive outcomes from this exploratory analysis, we did uncover some interesting influential drivers behind efficiency. So first off, this combines both vehicle age in the sense of the age of the vehicle and also as older vehicles explaining the degradation in the batteries themselves over time. So this confounds those two factors. One, that vehicles are tending to become more efficient over time. Secondly, in the sense that a model sold in 2022 is going to just have improved efficiency versus a model sold in 2014, and ignoring the degradation in battery, and then also factoring in the degradation in the battery itself. So we just see efficiency over time improving, and that's what this line shows here. Next slide. All-wheel drive tend to be less efficient than two-wheel drive. We've got more motors driving the vehicles with all-wheel drive, in some cases driving each wheel itself. And the two-wheel drive models just have higher efficiency than the all-wheel drive dual or quad motors as well. Next slide. EV motor power, pretty weak relationship with EV efficiency. You can see the spread in data here between EV motor power. This is the max output for each of the vehicles against the efficiency. Not a strong relationship here, so we couldn't really say much about this. Next slide. Larger wheels negatively impacts efficiency. So we see wheel size here really going down in efficiency the larger the wheel. And then looking at individual models themselves, it's similarly, we see the same degradation in efficiency as they have larger wheels at Model 3, Model S, and Model X all see similar relationships between wheel size and efficiency. Next slide. Weather matters, and weather, especially cold weather, matters more. We hear about this in the news about consumers griping about loss of efficiency and range in colder weather. But we see this both in colder climates. We also see it in warmer climates. So these charts shows groups of utilities in the north, in New England, in the Northeast, and then also in the Southeast, in the warmer southern climates. And we see degradation in the colder months, upwards of 25% loss in efficiency in the colder months relative to the highest efficiency months, which tend to be the shoulder months. Here you see May in New England, and we see February in the Southeast as having the highest efficiency. Very similar max efficiency there between the two regions. And then the drop off for the hotter climates in the summer tends to be about 15% loss in efficiency. Next slide. So we did learn a lot from the regressions. Low explanatory power, no matter what drivers, what attributes we used, only explained a minority of the variance in real world EV efficiency. When we ran the EPA model, interestingly, when we plugged in manufacture, all of a sudden it explained 75% of the variance. But as we noted in the first iteration where we looked at EPA against real world driving efficiency, that's purely a function of the manufacturers reporting likely efficiency ratings that are vastly different than real world driving conditions. And so therefore it's sort of a uh, ineffective explanatory function there for the EPA model. There are other attributes that we just didn't have available that might be able to explain things like use of the dog mode or other HVAC systems, auto drive. We just don't know, and we can't really use that to explain efficiency. All right, next slide. So load management. We took a look here. Oh, wait, whoops. I don't know what happened here. There's some, okay, great. So residential EV load, we took a look here at both vehicles and level 2 chargers. So for EVs, the load really depends on the battery rated acceptance. The chart on your right on the top is the rated acceptance kW for the current count of vehicles within the EPA data set. As you can see there, most of the vehicles are falling right now within the 11 kW range. And unsurprisingly, we see that with the same for level 2 chargers. Most of the level 2 chargers on the market right now are similarly rated at about 11 kW. So that's the second factor, charger type, whether it's level 1 or level 2, and the saturation of homeowners that have level 1 or level 2. Also, depending on what the homeowner chooses to install, whether they install nothing, keep it at level 1, whether they install or have a hardwired plug-in connection, or whether they'd use a hardwired system too, will vary the kW that goes to the vehicle. The level 2 charger itself rated at max output. Again, that chart on the right shows those kW values. Also, other drivers are the amperage of the panel circuit, whether the amperage is 30, 48, 60, will really have important influence on the kW that's delivered to the vehicle. And then also throttling. So if the battery in the vehicle's below or above 20 or 80% as it charges. Next slide. Oh, whoops. Yeah, battery age and temperature, obviously important factors too with charging. Next slide. Okay, so this takes a look at the average EV battery kW values within the Pacific Northwest. And the blue bars were the kW values that were available in 2019. And then the orange bars are the kW values that we found just from late last year. And we can see almost 50% higher kW between 2019 and end of 2024, going from 6.4 average kW to 9.5. And this is really driven by increased battery power levels. There's just more models being sold above 10 kW. Next slide. So taking a look at charger levels, as noted earlier, whether or not homeowners have level 1 or level 2 chargers is important to know. Saturation's hard to come by right now without doing studies of identifying level 1 versus level 2 chargers. Most of the owners do have a level 2 charger, whereas this study took a look at PHEV owners, and they typically have a level 1 charger. And level 2 chargers, again, if they're hardwired, they can max at 19 kW, which is helpful for the Ford F-150s, which max out at that, versus plug-in max is 9.6 kW. Next slide. So this is an example study taking a look at non-managed charging baseline EV load shapes. And I think this slide's been presented before to this group, so I'm not going to go into too much detail, but shows that generally pretty flat load shapes for plug-in hybrids and level 1 chargers. We do see spikier charging there for level 2 chargers, but typically overnight. Next slide. Looking at actual charging demand, we see two charts here. The first one on the left of the two on the left shows example KW across individual charging sessions, and the KWs there on the y-axis. And then we look at the KW over on the chart on the right, and the KWs on the x-axis, just to confuse everyone. But we do see similar KW load shapes really there for those charging sessions across the various two different studies. The one is the Massachusetts baseline study referred to before, and the one on the right is from RER charging data as well. I think that's it. Oh yeah. And then, yeah, key takeaways. So loads are highly flexible. This shouldn't come as a surprise. I think some of these bullets have been presented before, but taking a look at how those loads are managed by managed charging programs, very high compliance with programs, and programs using either behavioral or active load control. Both have similar impacts. Customers are very responsive to price signals or to managed charging programs, and they tend to switch. We also have seen some hybrid programs where they're really ineffective because take one or take the other, don't do both. If you have a time of use rate, that time of use rate is going to shift your customers off of peak, and there's really going to be little to no available demand left if you run a DR event. If you're doing managed charging, they're already charging overnight. They're not bothering, or they don't bother plugging in during the day. We know from plenty of surveys at this point that customers typically charge overnight. If they have a level 2 charger, they are plugging it in overnight. Most of their charging is also occurring at home. We just did a survey of a large group of EV owners and level 2 charger owners, and they all charge at home, typically charging overnight. And this is for a utility that also does time of use rates, and they all charge off peak. I think there's a few more bullets here. So yeah, both are effective fixed or variable incentives. So choose one option, and it's likely to be effective. And I think, yeah, this one's been presented before, so I'm not going to even touch on that to this group. And I think that's it. Whew. All right. I know I sped through a lot of that because we had a lot of slides and a lot of content. And so I'm interested in hearing questions, thoughts, discussion on anything so far. So
Great.
Thank you.
Looks like we had a couple from Gary. Thanks, Gary, for chiming in. He mentioned that it's surprising that the 5-cycle is less accurate. It seems like the 2-cycle may provide better outcomes for Tesla, Audi, and Rivian.
Yeah, so there's been apparently some discussion that somewhere, and I tried to find it, I could not find it, but somewhere out there is equivalent 2-cycle tests available if you dig deep. I haven't had a chance to explore or find this apparent data that's available for Audi, Rivian, and Tesla that reports their 2-cycle tests. If that's the case and those 2-cycle tests are actually comparable to the real world driving, then I think that's going to go a long way, obviously, of explaining the disconnects that we saw. There's been grumbling online in various EV forums about manufacturers' use and potential, I don't quite want to say manipulation of or gaming of 5-cycle tests, but the use of the 5-cycle tests certainly has allowed manufacturers to claim significantly higher range and efficiency than what we observe using real world charging driving session data.
That's interesting. Couple others here. How did yearly mileage driven impact the value of load management in your data? I don't know that you looked at that, but
No, we didn't look at that. It's a good question. It's a good question. It's actually something worth taking a look at, but we didn't explore that question.
yeah. All right. So did the research show any concerns about time of use rates leading to distribution peak impacts when the off-peak rate ends?
Good question. Let me see. It is absolutely typically not so much because well, actually, when what was the question again? Was it when off-peak
interesting.
ends or when
Yeah.
on-peak ends?
When the off-peak ends. So that means so when it's ramping up, seemingly.
Right.
So that's
We
saying,
went-
yeah, so when it's, so seemingly when it's switching from off-peak to on-peak, basically.
Right. Not so much an issue that I've observed in the load shape data that I've seen for time of use rates, because they won't be charging at that point anyways. The bigger concern is when they go from off peak to on peak and the spike that we see, because typically everyone has their EVs or their charging system set to automatically kick on at that point in time. 9 p.m., their off-peak rates kick on. They're already home in their garage. They're charging over 80% of their charging sessions are at home anyways, so those systems kick on all coincident.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Usually they're already done before that other switch takes place. That makes sense.
That's right.
And this is another one that I don't think we covered, but it's worth asking. Did it show any challenges getting customers enrolled in demand management programs? The load is flexible when people enroll, but it can be a challenge to get them enrolled.
Right, exactly. Enrollment's a whole nother challenge. And we've seen too, enrollment, there's gripes about auto enrollment in time of use. If you do participate in a program like a level 2 charger program, customers don't end up very happy about being forced onto a time of use rate if they're part of a rebate program. That being said, they do all then charge, and we see we do actually see a shift in charging behavior from on to off peak. It's pretty immediate, but yeah, that challenge of getting customers in is pretty universal. So
Yes.
yeah,
Yes.
no silver bullet yet there on that. It's really the price signals, I think, that are going to be really important to get them to agree.
Yes, absolutely. So I think we're dancing around this, but did you look at local distribution system impacts that can be exacerbated by TOU? So the idea being, oftentimes it's at a local level, not at a larger distribution level.
Right. Not yet. I would really like to. We did look at a similar type. We did a similar study on feeders for electrification and heat pumps, And on some of those feeders, we also knew that the homes had EVs too. So the presence of EVs confounded a bit of the analysis on the electrification sort of story as well, but we didn't exclusively focus on EVs on that. But the goal was trying to take a look at max loading on the feeders and whether or not, what kind of saturation levels would lead then to, problematic areas. And we knew the ratings of each of the individual feeders and whether or not those neighborhoods were going to experience some challenges and max out, and whether they were going to have to replace those feeders as well. So really great question. Important studies that need to be done, but unfortunately we haven't done one yet. So any utilities out there that want to do one, we're game. We're ready.
Great. Okay, so I like this one. Can you talk about how to interpret the low coincidence factors? Is this related to an average car not adding very much charge during a typical charging session?
Right. So they just not every homeowner charges every night. And this was surprising. I just figured everyone gets home and they just plug in and they just top off, but they don't. The surveys that I've done, I don't know, Katie, you might know this better from the charging session data, in terms of the number of, I feel like we even had that slide at some point that showed the number of typical charging sessions per week, maybe. And
Yeah,
at least in the survey
waited.
data, it's like 2 or 3, maybe. It's like they really only plug in when they need to. It's just sort of that if they're between 20 and 80, they're good.
Yeah.
And they sort of drive and then they'll top off when they need to. So it's just that low coincidence. They're just not all plugging in every night.
Yeah, they're not, if you'll allow me to extrapolate further.
Yeah.
They're not charging every day, and the coincidence is with peak, right? So they're not necessarily coming home and immediately plugging in at peak. They're setting their charging schedules, or they're plugging in later. It's just not coincident with the larger peak system load that we see generally coincident with people coming home and turning on their air conditioners in particular. So it's just a different, it's my soapbox, and Noah, I'm sure you can talk about it, of, EVs are not air conditioners. And so they charge when they want. And I think I had seen that most folks don't plug in between when they're at like 40% or something of range remaining. So they let it get down, but not too low. But they don't do it at 80% or 70% or whatever they're at, just generally at the end of the day. That's what I recall, is that.
That's right, because most of people's round trips are short distance. And I think there's that statistic, right, that 95% of people's driving is within a 20-mile radius of their home, and therefore they just don't have the need to charge every day. Similarly, we don't end up at the gas station. So yeah, people just aren't plugging it in.
So Scott weighed in. Yay, Scott.
Yeah, I saw that.
Being closer to 10 to 15% of cars charging at a typical charging time, a start of off-peak. That's why the total program KW is only sometimes about 1 KW. So really it's just that only 10 to 15% of folks are plugging in at the same time. Thanks, Scott. All right, so Gary, so this is an interesting idea. Since most EV drivers are switching from a comparable ICE vehicle, right? Not too many, that's the general switch. I'd be curious to see if particular classes of vehicles are better switch, even if the efficiency is lower, right? So for example, an EV Escalade has a very low efficiency for an EV, but the improvement versus the ICE model may be greater than a small SUV to a Model Y. So that's really looking at the delta. And I think when we're talking about efficiency, it's always hard to look at ICE versus
Right.
EVs because our metrics are off.
Right.
Um,
Yep. So there's no question, it's basically flipped. So for ice, you have 20% of your energy used for propulsion, 80% of your energy is lost. And it's the exact opposite for EVs. You have 80% of your energy going to propulsion, and you're only losing about 20%. EPA has a great graphic. It's like a waterfall graphic. About that exactly. And so yeah, you're gaining. With this study, what we were looking at, we weren't considering fuel switching. We weren't looking, our baseline was already an electric vehicle. So it's going from lower efficiency electric vehicle to higher efficiency electric vehicle, ignoring the fuel benefit, maintenance benefit, and everything else that goes along with converting from a gasoline to EV.
That makes sense. So I had a question when you were looking at the slide about the weather piece. It was talking about how, colder climates and warmer climates. I was curious so is that saying that, the shoulder seasons are approximately the same efficiency? I guess I wanted to confirm that you weren't saying that like colder efficiency and higher efficiency happen. I guess I always get stuck on the problem with draining during cold climates, like during cold climates. But what this is showing here is that there's also a pretty good drop during the heat of the summer.
Right.
Okay.
Correct. Yes. So you can see the heat of the summer in the New England climate doesn't have that much of a detrimental effect or impact on efficiency in New England. But the heat of the summer in the Southwest, very, very deep Southwest, does have a very detrimental impact on efficiency, but not quite to the extent that the cold during the winter in New England has on efficiency. So cold has a more profound effect on the battery drain and efficiency performance of a vehicle relative to heat.
But it did
But
drop.
when we see shoulder seasons, and shoulder being sort of late spring for New England, and in February for deep southeast, we see very, very, very similar peak efficiency during those sort of more temperate shoulder months. So driving EVs in California makes a lot of sense because it's 70 degrees out all the time, and EVs are rocking. Driving EVs up in colder states, yeah, you do see a significant drop in efficiency. Decide to take and tow your floating fishing boat on a little road trip with some friends and colleagues to go fishing up in the mountains in your EV, even though it's brand new. Expect to stop and charge your EV 3 times on a short trip by towing your fishing boat. And I just say that because I just heard an anecdote from a colleague who just complained about having to charge their vehicle 3 times on a trip that's less than 100 miles away from their house.
Whoa.
Yeah,
That's crazy.
yeah.
So a couple comments on this as well. This is a good conversation, which is for the cold weather piece, did you look at whether an EV had a heat pump or not?
Yeah. So the heat pump, unfortunately, so this is a great topic because it's one where we were hoping we could use that and identify it within the data to be able to explain some of that efficiency. And what would be required would be individually identifying each specific model, whether or not it has a heat pump for the HVAC system, and then adding that into the analysis. We just were limited in terms of our scope, budget, time to be able to root out every single attribute sort of more manually. And that was one of our core recommendations at the end, was that the VIN data was missing, unfortunately, a lot of attribute that should otherwise be captured. And since VIN data is so universally, it's such a universal classification system, it seems ripe to just have that as the established reference source for all vehicle attributes. And then that would really help some of this noise that we found in being able to match vehicles across various data sources. But yeah, heat pump, we unfortunately couldn't use that. And I know a lot of the Teslas have the heat pumps, and we saw just the Teslas with really poor performance against rated efficiencies. Some people speculated that, it's just typical Tesla drivers. They tend to be, more aggressive and drive faster than maybe those that are driving Nissan Leafs or Chevy Bolts and Volts and so forth. But I mean, you laugh at it, and we laughed at it, but again, we couldn't really use that to explain anything. And yeah, grandma versus the Fast and Furious drivers. I mean, they're out there, and they probably, people just, the behavior piece is very important. We just can't use it to explain efficiency right now. Maybe one day.
I mean, my Volvo does not have a ludicrous speed.
Does not have a ludicrous, right?
So
it's true, though. It's true. I mean, there's a real element to new EV owners, and I've seen this, and I'm not going to call out any colleagues, but I've experienced this driving in their new electric vehicles, that they tend to sort of show off the acceleration. And yeah, you accelerate in an EV, there goes your efficiency. So.
Yep. No, it's true. And Catherine made a good point here about the efficiency drop in warmer climates being associated to the AC, to an increase. So
for sure.
It does seem that while the heating piece of it takes up more energy from the battery, the AC, any HVAC, does seem to impact it.
Yeah, and that's where the waste heat from typical operations anyways tends to contribute to, I guess, it contributes less to impacting the energy consumption of a vehicle. So there was some study did try to explore HVAC systems on battery drain, and found that it's worse to run your heating fan than it is to run like heating seats, or heating your seats, heating your steering wheel tends to be more efficient than heating the air of your EV, and that the heating, the HVAC system itself, I forget the percent that they attributed the loss of the vehicle, but it wasn't massive. I don't want to say the percent, but it wasn't as significant as I expected.
That makes sense.
On a heating side. On cooling, I think it's a different story.
Yeah.
Good point.
Yeah. So I also saw here cold weather also has somewhat lower efficiency for ICE vehicles, roads covered in snow and ice. Yep. That makes sense. Awesome. I think we've done really well. Rich, do you want to close us off? Thank you again, Noah, for talking to us. I love listening to all this good data. Please reach out to Noah. I know his information is on the next slide. If you have any further questions, he has a plethora of information on this.
Noah, do me a favor, go ahead and drop your email address in the chat just for safety's sake. So So thank you, Katie and Noah, for this interesting conversation and these very interesting results around what's going on in this market. It's greatly appreciated, and thank you for the time and effort that you put into this.
Thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate and your time.
In addition, for those of you still with us, just a reminder, join us in Kansas City for our conference in less than 2 weeks. The same Electric Transportation Interest Group, those four fine ladies you saw earlier, are bringing a session on Monday, May 5th called Half Baked, Valuing EV Load Management Programs. They're Speaking of half baked, they're bringing Bill LeBlanc into that conversation, which will always be entertaining. And along those lines, it should be really interesting conversation because valuation around all this is certainly a very interesting and prudent topic at this point in time. And Katie's going to have cookies, so there you go. In addition, just a reminder in general, hey, we're going to be in Kansas City with about 400 people, May 5th through 7th for our spring conference. If you haven't registered yet, there is still time. Look forward to seeing you all there. And then lastly, just want to thank everyone for taking the time and so glad that you could be here. This has been a Hot Topics conversation from PLMA. Thanks for joining us, and everyone, please have a great day.